There is a map, folded and stored inside a government archive, the kind no one looks at unless they already know what they are searching for. It shows a cave system beneath southeastern New Mexico, Carlsbad Caverns National Park, a place officially described as nothing more than dissolved limestone. The passages stretch for miles, branching, dividing, reconnecting, forming a network so complex that even now, it is still being mapped. But if you trace those passages carefully, slowly, the way a botanist would study a living organism, something begins to feel wrong. The tunnels do not wander randomly. They do not collapse into chaos. They follow a pattern, precise, repeating, almost intentional. They branch the way something alive branches, not like rivers, not like cracks, like roots. That is not speculation. That is the word used in the scientific record, dendritic, from the Greek dendron, meaning tree. The same term used to describe root systems in living forests. The same structure, the same geometry, appearing underground at a scale so large you could walk through it and never realize what you were inside of. And here is the problem no one addresses. If these formations on the surface, the flat-topped mesas, the hexagonal columns, the structures that look like cut stumps, if those were ever part of something larger, then the roots should still exist. They would not disappear. They would spread outward, miles in every direction, carving through the earth, leaving behind channels, voids, networks, something you could map, something you could explore, something exactly like this, because this is not the only place it happens. Because this is not the beneath Black Hills. Less than 70 miles from Devil's Tower, two of the longest cave systems in the world branch outward beneath a dome-shaped uplift, their geometry described using the same word, dendritic, their structure matching the same pattern. And yet, no one asks the simplest question. What if the roots were never missing? What if we have been walking through them this entire time, and calling them something else? To understand why this question matters, you have to start with something deceptively simple: how roots actually behave in the real world, not in diagrams, not in textbooks, simplified for clarity, but in living systems. Most people imagine roots as thick structures driving straight down into the earth, anchoring a tree like cables. That image is wrong. In mature trees, especially the larger species, roots do not grow downward in dominance, they spread outward. A coastal redwood, one of the tallest trees currently known, rarely sends its roots deeper than a few meters. Instead, it expands laterally, forming a vast shallow network that can extend dozens of meters from the trunk. These roots interweave with neighboring trees, forming a continuous underground structure, a living lattice that stabilizes the entire forest. Now scale that up, not slightly, radically. If a structure existed that rose not hundreds, but thousands of feet into the air, its root system would not extend tens of meters. It would extend for miles. The base would not be a single point. It would be a central hub from which massive lateral structures spread outward, branching into smaller and smaller divisions, primary, secondary, tertiary, following the same fractal geometry observed in every root system on Earth. Those structures would not sit quietly inside the soil. They would displace the surrounding geology. They would push through sediment layers, carve channels, fracture rock, and when they decayed or mineralized, they would leave behind something very specific: a network, not random voids, not chaotic collapse. A radial, branching system extending outward from a central origin point. That description should feel familiar, because when researchers mapped the passages beneath Carlsbad Caverns National Park, what they found was not a scattered series of hollow spaces. The system contains over 100 known caves, with the main cavern extending for dozens of kilometers. The largest chamber, known as the Big Room, stretches thousands of feet in length, hundreds in width, and rises high enough to contain entire structures within it. The official explanation is chemical dissolution, sulfuric acid interacting with limestone over immense spans of time. The chemistry is sound, the process is documented, but chemistry explains removal. It explains how material disappears. It does not explain why what remains follows a pattern. The passages do not form in isolation. They branch, they subdivide. Larger chambers connect to smaller tunnels which divide again, extending outward in repeating sequences. Speleologists, the scientists who study caves, describe these systems using a specific term, dendritic, the same word used in botany. The explanation given is convergence, that different processes can produce similar patterns because they follow the same physical laws, energy moving through a medium, taking the path of least resistance, naturally creating branching structures. It is a clean explanation, a complete one, and it might be correct. But it introduces a deeper question. If the geometry is identical, if the structure is identical, if the terminology itself is borrowed from biology to describe what is being observed underground, then why has no one formally tested whether the relationship is more than visual similarity? Because this is not an isolated case. In Kentucky, beneath the rolling surface of Mammoth Cave National Park, the longest known cave system on Earth extends for 426 miles, with new sections still being discovered. The passages follow the same logic: horizontal dominance, branching networks, central corridors feeding into smaller tributaries, again described as dendritic. Different location, different geology, same pattern. And that is where the coincidence begins to repeat often enough that it stops feeling like coincidence. Because once you see the pattern in one place, you start to recognize it everywhere. And that is when the question changes. Not what are we looking at, but why has it only ever been explained one way? The pattern does not stop in New Mexico, and it does not stop in Kentucky. It repeats again, with unsettling consistency, beneath entirely different landscapes, under entirely different conditions, as if the same blueprint were being expressed through multiple layers of what we call geology. In the Yucatan Peninsula, beneath the limestone surface of southeastern Mexico, an immense underwater network stretches outward, connecting hundreds of vertical shafts known as cenotes. This system, referred to as Sac Acton, extends for 215 miles, forming one of the largest submerged cave networks on Earth. From above, the cenotes appear as nearly perfect circles, steep-sided, descending vertically into darkness. From below, they connect through lateral passages that branch and subdivide in the same way seen elsewhere. Vertical shafts above, horizontal branching below. That configuration should also feel familiar, because in large tree systems, there are two distinct types of roots: lateral roots, which spread outward near the surface, and deeper structures often referred to as tap roots or sinker roots, which descend vertically to access water and stabilize the organism. The geometry is not identical, but the relationship is consistent. Vertical channels connected by horizontal networks. All used, and once again, the explanation provided is dissolution. Water moving through soluble rock, forming sinkholes from above and tunnels beneath. A process repeated over immense spans of time. A process that accounts for the mechanism, but still, not the pattern, because the same structure appears again beneath the Black Hills, where two massive cave systems, Jewel Cave National Monument and Wind Cave National Park, extend for 216 miles beneath a single geological formation. The passages branch in 3 dimensions, not just horizontally, forming interconnected webs that expand outward beneath the surface. And above them sits something else. A dome, an uplifted mass of rock, oval in shape, stretching over 100 miles in length, rising from the surrounding plains. The official explanation describes it as a laccolith, magma pushing upward beneath the surface, lifting the layers above without breaking through. The surrounding strata curve upward around it, bending as if something forced its way from below. The same displacement pattern documented at the base of Devil's Tower in the late 19th century. Layers pushed aside, material displaced outward. Now place those observations next to each other, not as isolated facts but as a system. On the surface, formations that display hexagonal columns, structures often compared to petrified wood. Beneath the surface, branching networks extending outward in dendritic patterns. And between them, a central uplift shaped like a transition point, a swelling where something larger would connect above and below. Individually, each element has an explanation. Together, they form a structure. And there is one more layer that complicates this even further, because in living forests, roots do not operate alone. They form symbiotic relationships with fungal networks, microscopic threads known as hyphae, which extend outward from the roots, increasing their reach, connecting individual trees into vast shared systems. These networks transfer nutrients, water, even chemical signals, allowing entire forests to function as interconnected organisms. At small scales, these structures are invisible. At larger scales, they would not be. If root systems extended for miles, the associated fungal networks would also expand, forming complex three-dimensional webs beneath the surface. And when those organic structures decayed or mineralized, they would not vanish. They would leave behind something physical: tunnels, interconnections, mineral-lined passages. Inside Jewel Cave National Monument, the walls are coated in calcite crystals. The passages do not simply branch, they intersect, reconnect, forming networks that resemble webs more than trees. The morphology is not just root-like, it is networked, layered, interwoven, and once again, the explanation is chemical: mineral deposition, replacement over time, which may be true. But it leaves one question unanswered. Why does every layer of this system, surface, subsurface, and internal structure, align with the architecture of a living organism while being classified entirely as something else? Because at some point, the question is no longer about whether each piece can be explained individually. It becomes about whether the system itself has ever been questioned as a whole, and that is where the silence begins. At this point, the argument reaches a boundary, and it is important to acknowledge it clearly, because this is where most discussions either collapse into speculation or retreat into certainty. The fact that cave systems branch like roots does not prove they are roots. Branching is one of the most common structural outcomes in nature. Rivers branch, lightning branches, blood vessels branch, even fractures in drying mud follow similar patterns. The physics behind this is well understood. Energy moving through a medium, whether it is water, electricity, or stress, distributes itself along paths of least resistance, and that distribution naturally produces branching geometries. This is known as convergent morphology: different processes, same patterns, same outcome. So no, the existence of dendritic cave systems does not confirm a biological origin, but it does something more subtle. It removes the certainty of exclusivity, because if the same geometry appears in both biological and geological systems, then the classification becomes a choice, not an inevitability. And once classification becomes a choice, the question shifts again, from what is this to why is it defined this way and not another. That question becomes even more difficult to ignore when you consider the spatial relationships involved. Not just the patterns, but where those patterns occur. Near Devil's Tower, one of the most recognizable columnar formations in the world, two of the longest cave systems on Earth extend outward beneath the Black Hills, less than 70 miles away. These are not isolated anomalies scattered randomly across the planet. They are clustered, connected by proximity as well as structure. The Black Hills themselves are not a typical formation. They rise as a dome from the surrounding plains, composed of igneous and metamorphic rock, pushing upward through sedimentary layers that bend around them. The scale is immense, stretching over 100 miles in length and dozens in width. The explanation again is internal pressure, magma intruding beneath the surface, lifting what lies above. But when you place that dome within the larger pattern, surface formations resembling truncated columns, underground systems branching outward, the uplift begins to resemble something else. Not conclusively, not definitively, but structurally, a transition point. In biological systems, there is a region where the trunk meets the root system, often referred to as the root crown. It is not simply a connection. It is a transformation zone, where vertical growth transitions into lateral spread, where the structure thickens, expands, and redistributes. The Black Hills exhibit a similar configuration, a central mass, swelling upward, with surrounding layers displaced outward, and beneath it, networks extending laterally in all directions. This does not prove equivalence, but it establishes correspondence at multiple levels: surface morphology, subsurface architecture, and intermediate structure. And then there is the historical layer. In the 19th century, as geological sciences were being formalized, a principle was established by Charles Lyell, known as uniformitarianism. The idea was simple. The processes observed in the present are the same as those that operated in the past at the same rates and scales. The present becomes the ceiling for what is considered possible. If no tree exists today beyond a certain height, then no tree has ever existed beyond that height. But the fossil record contradicts this assumption repeatedly. During earlier periods, atmospheric conditions were different, oxygen levels higher, pressures altered, and as a result, organisms existed at scales far beyond what we observe today. Massive insects, enormous reptiles, plant systems that do not have direct modern equivalents, scale changes with conditions. That is not controversial, that is documented. Yet when it comes to plant structures at extreme scales, the assumption remains fixed. The absence of a modern example becomes evidence of historical impossibility. And that is where the framework begins to limit the question itself. Because if the classification system is built on present constraints, then anything that exceeds those constraints is automatically excluded, not because it has been tested and disproven, but because it does not fit within the allowed parameters. Which raises a different kind of question. Not whether the evidence proves a biological origin, but whether the possibility of one was ever allowed to be tested in the first place. And if it was not, then what we are looking at may not be misunderstood. It may be unexamined. There is a point where all of this stops being a comparison and starts becoming a pattern that repeats too consistently to ignore, not because it proves anything outright, but because it aligns across multiple scales, multiple locations, and multiple systems, all describing the same structure from different angles. Think about what would remain if something like this ever existed. Not the living organism itself that would decay, collapse, disappear, but the densest parts, the most structurally resilient components, those would persist. Over time, they would mineralize, harden, integrate into the surrounding environment until they were no longer recognized as something separate. What would be left is not a tree, it would be a landscape. Vertical structures rising from flat terrain, uniform, columnar, fractured into repeating geometric patterns. Surrounding those structures, layers of displaced material, bent, lifted, reshaped as if something once occupied the space and forced everything else outward. Beneath those same formations, networks extending laterally, branching into smaller and smaller passages, forming systems that can be mapped but not easily explained as a whole. That is what we see. Across continents, formations that share the same visual signature, flat tops, hexagonal columns, vertical faces. Beneath them, cave systems described using the same terminology as biological structures. Around them, geological features that indicate displacement, uplift, and restructuring of the surrounding material. Individually, each of these observations has an explanation. Together, they form a continuity that is rarely addressed. Even large-scale erosion systems begin to follow this same logic. The Grand Canyon, stretching for 277 miles, carved over immense spans of time by the Colorado River, is described as a result of gradual erosion. The main channel cuts through the terrain, while smaller canyons branch outward from it, forming a network that again is described using the same term, dendritic. The side canyons do not form randomly. They branch from the main channel, subdividing into smaller parts, following the same fractal geometry observed in root systems, in cave networks, in every layer we have examined. And once again, the explanation is process. Water, gravity, time, which may be entirely correct, but it still leaves one question unresolved. Why does every system, surface formations, underground networks, erosion patterns, all converge on the same structural language while being treated as completely unrelated phenomena? At some point, the repetition itself becomes the evidence, not of a conclusion, but of a question that has never been fully pursued. Because if you step back far enough, remove the labels, remove the classifications, remove the assumptions about what is allowed and what is not, what remains is not a collection of separate features. It is a system, a vertical component, a lateral network, an interconnected structure beneath the surface. And that system appears again and again in different forms under different explanations, but always with the same underlying geometry. The caves are still being mapped. New passages are still being discovered inside Mammoth Cave National Park and Jewel Cave National Monument, extending the networks further into the earth. The terminology has not changed. The word dendritic still means what it always meant: tree, and above those systems, the formations remain, unmoved, unchanged, standing exactly where the roots would be. There is a tendency, when confronted with patterns like this, to search for a definitive answer, something that resolves the tension, something that tells you exactly what you are looking at, so the question can finally end. But that is not what this leads to, because the evidence does not collapse into a single conclusion. It does something far more unsettling. It leaves two explanations standing side by side, equally consistent with what we observe. Either the branching patterns beneath the earth, the cave systems, the networks, the dendritic structures, are simply the inevitable result of physical processes repeating across different environments: water, pressure, time, carving the same geometry again and again because the laws governing those processes do not change. Or, those patterns persist because they are not just the result of physics, they are the remnants of something that once followed the same blueprint for a different reason entirely. Something that grew, expanded, connected, and left behind a structure so vast that it no longer registers as biological. And if that possibility was never seriously tested, not dismissed, not disproven, but never even fully explored, then the question remains open in a way that is difficult to ignore. Because the caves are still there, the formations above them are still there. The terminology has not changed, the geometry has not changed, only the interpretation has. So the next time you look at a map of a cave system, or stand at the edge of a formation like Devil's Tower, or trace the branching lines of a canyon cutting through the land, there is a question that does not go away once it appears. Not what you have been told it is, but what it would look like if it was something else entirely.